Hi, this is Remembering the Past with Corey Franklin, the show where we talk about people who've died recently, who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with Joseph Murray, who died recently at the age of 93. And Joseph Murray is part of one of those coincidences that we see every once in a while on Remembering the Past, where two people who are connected in some way historically die in a very short period of time. For his medical work, Joseph Murray received the 1990 Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology, which he shared with E. Donnell Thomas. And if you'll remember, we did E. Donnell Thomas about a month ago. He was the man who perfected the bone marrow transplant. For his part, Joseph Murray was a surgeon who performed the first successful human organ transplant. He performed the first kidney transplant at Peter Bent Brigham Hospital in Boston in 1954, and this instituted the entire science of organ transplantation. Through their separate works, Doctors Murray and Thomas opened up the field of immunosuppression for organ transplantation and the study of organ rejection. Dr. Murray's career started out at Harvard Medical School. He interned at Brigham Hospital, and he went into the Army Corps in 1944, and he began treating soldiers who had suffered severe burn wounds. Burn medicine is one of the most demanding specialties in surgery, in fact, in all of medicine, and his interest was in skin grafting, and especially in cadaver skin grafting, and he realized that cadaver skin could be used to treat burn wounds. So during and after the war, his main concentration was on how to get people who were burned to accept cadaver skin to heal their burn wounds. From that, he moved to organ transplantation. Many of the surgeons at Harvard dissuaded him from organ transplantation. They thought it was Frankenstein-like stuff. But he understood from his work with skin that if the rejection process could be controlled, you could actually transplant an entire organ. He realized that the key to rejection was the similarity of the donor and the recipient, and so his first subject for a kidney transplant was a 23-year-old man named Richard Herrick who had an identical twin. You have to understand how groundbreaking this whole thing was. The first thing he did was take a healthy kidney out of Herrick's identical twin, and no one had ever taken a healthy kidney out of anybody before for the purposes of anything, let alone organ transplantation. Then they removed one of the diseased kidneys from Herrick and put in the transplant kidney from his brother, and watched to see whether or not blood flow would start in the new organ and whether or not urine would appear from the functional kidney. When that happened, it was like a miracle in the operating room. Richard Herrick went on to live another 8 years. He married one of the nurses who was taking care of him. He had 2 children. And Ronald Herrick, his brother who had donated the kidney, lived with 1 kidney until the age of 79. Dr. Murray became a hero in the medical community because this had been tried before and had failed. Since he had used identical twins, and by the way, he checked them with the police, he checked their fingerprints to make sure they were indeed identical twins, there was no question of tissue rejection. But he went on in 1959 to perform the first successful transplant of a non-identical twin, and in 1962 he performed the first successful cadaver transplant, where someone received a cadaver kidney. Dr. Murray trained transplant surgeons for all over the world, and then later in the 1960s they began transplanting hearts, then lungs, then livers. We can say that the 1950s were the decade in which organ transplantation actually began. The 1960s were the decade in which the surgical technique was refined. The 1970s were the decade in which the study of immunosuppression became popular, and the 1980s were the decade in which this all came together and organ transplantation became an accepted treatment for organ failure. Today, organ transplantation, while still a sophisticated surgery, is routine in hospitals across the world. Ironically, by the 70s, Dr. Murray had moved out of organ transplantation and back to his first love, which was plastic surgery. He wasn't one of those high society plastic surgeons. He worked primarily with patients with facial abnormalities, and he continued his work with skin grafting. So in a sense, transplant surgery was a hobby for Joseph Murray. And the chief surgeon at Harvard Medical School said he was the only person to win a Nobel Prize for working on his avocation.
There was no point in going to a library because you knew that nobody ever had done it in the world. We were just taking care of patients. And we didn't know it was going to be a historic operation. We just knew that we were in a position to help a person who's dying. Of course, now that's commonplace. We expect kidneys to function, but this was a first, and it was very exciting. I never realized it would have such ramifications. It was just a day's work, really.
We're going to move on now to Marvin Miller, who died recently at the age of 95. And Marvin Miller was the labor leader who took over the leadership of the Baseball Players Association in 1966, and in the next 15 years transformed baseball. It was through Marvin Miller's work that baseball players earned their rights, earned their money, and earned their free agency, and he's been called one of the three most important figures in the history of baseball, along with Babe Ruth and Jackie Robinson. When he took over the Players Union in 1966, the average player's salary was under $10,000. When I started working at Wrigley Field with players in 1970 on the ground crew, they were still making under $20,000 as an average. Today, baseball players are making on average over $3 million. Here's an ESPN report on Marvin Miller and what he accomplished for baseball.
The strongest union in pro sports is baseball. And a big reason why was the presence of Marvin Miller over 3 decades ago. The legendary baseball labor leader died this morning, liver cancer taking his life at the age of 95. Now, in 1968, Miller negotiated the first collective bargaining agreement in pro sports. It later led to baseball free agency. 44 years ago, he helped increase the league minimum from $6,000 to $10,000. The league minimum this year is $480,000. Hank Aaron, Hall of Famer, once called Miller's role as important to the history of baseball as Jackie Robinson. Miller was an economist for the U.S. government and then the United Steelworkers of America before joining the MLBPA. In addition to leading the charge for arbitration and free agency, he also guided players through 3 strikes and 2 lockouts during his tenure. Once again, Marvin Miller was 95 years old. Baseball insider Tim Kurkjian giving us some perspective here. Tim, for those who don't know, what was Miller's impact in the game of baseball as we know it?
Well, Kevin, he was one of the most influential figures in baseball history. There is no way around that. You have to understand that the Players Association was formed in 1954, but it really didn't get going officially until Marvin Miller was hired in 1966. He essentially brought us free agency when Curt Flood challenged the reserve clause, and Marvin Miller was right next to him, emboldening him to go ahead and do this. It took a courageous man like Curt Flood to do it, but it took Marvin Miller by his side in order to get the process going. And then years later, when Catfish Hunter was in a contract negotiation with the A's, Marvin Miller filed a grievance on his behalf, and he essentially became the first true free agent and made an enormous amount of money off of that. Andy Messersmith followed later, another grievance filed by Marvin Miller. The bottom line is this. When he took over, the average salary in the major leagues was $52,600. And now the average salary is over $3 million. And that has everything to do with Marvin Miller and what he did when he first took over the Major League Players Association.
Monumental impact, Tim. So why isn't Marvin Miller in the Baseball Hall of Fame?
Kevin, I don't know. I was on a veteran committee a couple of years ago, and his name came up, and of course, I voted for him, but he did not get the requisite number of votes, and I think the bottom line is this. There are a lot of people in management in baseball who never liked or appreciated or respected Marvin Miller because he was on the other side, and he was such a relentless negotiator and such a ferocious competitor that a lot of people in management think that baseball has been ruined to some degree because of the salaries, when obviously that's not the case, because you know, the revenues in baseball are up so high now, and the salaries just go up with it. So I think it's just a case where management figures do not like him, and that is really unfortunate. But the bottom line is this, Kevin. You cannot write the history of baseball without Marvin Miller being right in the middle of it. And to me, the Hall of Fame is a museum which chronicles the history of the game, and you can't chronicle the history of baseball without Marvin Miller.
2 minor misstatements by Kurkjian there. 1, the average salary was not $50,000. It was actually under $20,000 when Marvin Miller took over. And 2, I think Tim Kurkjian does know why Marvin Miller's not in the Hall of Fame. For you sports economists and sports law people out there, we're going to give Marvin Miller's role in the 3 critical cases that changed baseball, all from the 1970s. The first in 1972, the Curt Flood case. Curt Flood, the center fielder for the St. Louis Cardinals, who was traded to the Philadelphia Phillies, didn't want to go, took his case to the Supreme Court. He ultimately lost, but it was a groundbreaking case that was going to change baseball.
Miller's legacy as a player activist began in 1969 when a three-time All-Star center fielder faced an unwanted trade.
I had come to know Curt Flood, and he informed me that he would like to file an antitrust lawsuit against Major League Baseball.
After spending 12 years with the Cardinals, Flood had no desire to be traded and recruited Miller to represent him. While their attempt was unsuccessful, it did not go unnoticed.
The Flood lawsuit raised the consciousness of numerous people in the press, numerous fans, and I can't help but believe that it raised the consciousness of many players.
As I said, Curt Flood lost that case before the Supreme Court in the early 70s, but shortly after that, Catfish Hunter, who was the best pitcher on the world champion Oakland A's of the early 70s, decided he wanted to become a free agent, and Marvin Miller was involved in that too.
Since the beginning of professional baseball, no one had ever been in a position to hold the club owners in check. The owners had grown so comfortable, in fact, that when one carelessly defaulted on a player contract in 1974, he was completely unprepared for the ramifications.
The owners were people without experience in this kind of situation. Some of them had business experience outside of baseball, where the real world existed and where employees could thumb their nose at you and go get a job somewhere else. But some of them had no such experience, had no experience with unions. The ranks of the owners were filled with those who had been long-time owners at that point in time, who had gotten used to the whole idea that a player had no power on his own.
Miller alerted the player in question and directed him through arbitration, where he won the decision and avoided contract. The player signed with the New York Yankees. The Oakland A's had lost future Hall of Famer Jim Catfish Hunter to free agency and their own arrogance. The tide was turning.
The tide turned completely with the Andy Messersmith-Dave McNally case, where the two pitchers challenged the reserve clause and won through arbitration, and their strategy was guided by Marvin Miller. The end of the reserve clause opened up a new era in baseball.
Miller now felt the time was right to challenge the reserve clause that had bound the player to one team for life.
If they couldn't get the player to agree to the next one-year contract, and they almost all were 1 year then, the owner had a right, under the contract, to renew the contract himself without the player's signature. Unilateral renewal. He couldn't cut it more than 25%, something like that. They couldn't cut the last year's salary more than 25%. But other than that, he had the right to renew the contract by himself, whether the player wanted to or not, for one additional year. And that's what the contract said. How did they parlay this into a lifetime control? They argued that when they renewed the contract, they renewed the renewal clause, that they could do this for the player's lifetime.
With Marvin Miller now leading a strong union, players could stand toe-to-toe with the owners.
The professional athlete in the NBA or the NHL or the NFL or the Major League Baseball cannot be replaced as a group. Absolutely impossible. With that kind of strength that unity would provide, I used to tell the players, I think you can have anything you want that's reasonable and fair, without limit. And somebody would raise his hand and say, you mean a reserve clause would go? Yeah. I say, yeah, even a reserve clause.
Miller met with Andy Messersmith and Dave McNally. At Miller's urging, the two pitchers did not sign the one-year renewal contract sent to them by their club owners. Now, when those contracts expired in 1975, the Players Association filed for free agency on their behalf, claiming that an unsigned contract could not be renewed.
We filed a grievance saying that the contract itself, the player's contract with an owner, really didn't provide for the lifetime control that they had argued gave them the right to do this. The only right that the reserve clause ever gave him, he had the right to renew it without the player's signature for one additional year. The arbitrator was faced with a very simple problem. he had to interpret what that language meant. And he interpreted one additional year to mean, surprise, one additional year. And he said, when that additional year is over, the player is a free agent.
Professional sports would never be the same.
Marvin Miller should definitely be in the Baseball Hall of Fame. It's clear that vested interests have kept him out. I think he erred in his stance in drug testing. He said late in life that he would have fought vigorously against performance-enhancing drug testing. At that point, I think he was putting union solidarity above the health interests and the interests of the players. But there's no denying the legacy that Marvin Miller has for baseball and will always have for professional sports. I'm going to close tonight with Earl Carroll, who died recently at the age of 75. And Earl Carroll was the lead singer of the Harlem-based R&B group from the 1950s, the Cadillacs. Again, they were contemporaries of Cleve Duncan and the Penguins, who we talked about recently when we talked about Earth Angel. Cadillacs were formed in 1953. They call themselves the Cadillacs because most of the groups were naming themselves after birds. There were the Penguins, there were the Orioles, there were the Robins. So they decided to go with a car, and they went with the best car possible. The Cadillacs were known at the time for their flamboyant attire and their intricate choreography. Their main choreographer was a man named Charlie Atkins, who went on to Motown and choreographed most of the great Motown acts. Charlie Atkins is one of those forgotten heroes of R&B and Motown. And in many respects, the Cadillacs were the forerunners of the Temptations. As I said, Earl Carroll was their lead singer, and like the Penguins with Earth Angel, the Cadillacs only had one big song, but it was a monster song just like Earth Angel because it has one of the signature lines in all of rock and roll. They were coming back from a gig in Massachusetts one night. They went by a military base. They saw a torpedo there. One of the other band members was goofing at Earl Carroll, probably some drinking going on, and he said, "You've got a head shaped like a bullet, like one of those torpedoes. You're SPEEDO the torpedo." And Earl Carroll said, "My name is Mr. Earl." Well, from that came the song SPEEDO with the famous line, "They often call me SPEEDO, but my real name is Mr. Earl." In late 1955, SPEEDO became a national hit. Went to number 17 on the pop charts, number 3 on the R&B charts, and if anything, it was even more popular because of that line. It featured their characteristic scat, and it's familiar to listeners even today.
Now they often call me SPEEDO, but my real name is Mister. Now they often call me SPEEDO, but my real name is Mister. Some may call me Joe, some may call me Mo. Just remember SPEEDO, he don't never take it slow. Well, now they often call me SPEEDO, but my real name is Mister.
Hey, that's classic mid-50s R&B. Thought I'd play you one other Cadillac song from late 1958, early 1959, Please Mr. Johnson. Introduced by Alan Freed. He really loved these guys.
Here are the Cadillacs.
We are broke, ain't got a dime to buy a Coke. Can we have some credit at the candy store? Please, Mr. Johnson. No more. Wash the windows, we gon' mop. You'll give us 2 red lollipops. Keep all the alley cats out the store. Please, Mr. Johnson. No more.
Yeah, that's early crossover R&B by the Cadillacs. I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. And as a final tribute to Earl Carroll, a lot of the R&B groups from the early and mid-50s did Christmas songs. You may be familiar with the Coasters' famous version of White Christmas. The Cadillacs also did a pretty well-known Christmas song as a follow-up to SPEEDO in 1956. Since it's Christmas season, I thought we'd end tonight with the Cadillacs' version of Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, featuring Earl Carroll as the lead singer.
Rudolph the red-nosed reindeer had a very shiny mouth. And if you ever saw it, you would even say it, no. All of the other reindeer, they used to laugh and call him names. They wouldn't let poor Rudolph join in any reindeer